Imagine fighting the longest, most expensive war in your entire nation's history. I mean, trillions of dollars spent.
Yeah, staggering amount of money.
Right. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost. 2 full decades of just relentless combat spanning 4 different presidential administrations.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of timeline.
It really is. And on the very last day, after all that blood and treasure, you basically hand the keys to the country right back to the exact same people you invaded to overthrow 20 years prior.
Yeah.
That isn't some, dystopian novel. That is the stark, paradoxical reality of the war in Afghanistan.
It is the absolute definition of a geopolitical closed loop. I mean, a 20-year conflict that ended almost exactly where it began.
With the Taliban in power in Kabul.
Exactly.
And, well, that is the profound, staggering reality we are tackling today. You are joining us for a deep dive into the war in Afghanistan.
And our mission here is explicitly clear.
Right. We are going to guide you chronologically through the major turning points of this conflict.
Tracking the journey from the initial invasion, right in the shadow of 9/11.
All the way to the final, incredibly chaotic withdrawal in 2021.
And we're relying strictly on a massive compilation of historical data and documentation to construct this timeline.
Because our goal is to help make sense of an overwhelming, complex web of events.
Right. We want to understand not just the timeline, but the actual mechanics of the conflict, like how and why it happened the way it did.
And just to be clear up front, we are going to examine the facts impartially across multiple international administrations.
Looking at the structural realities on the ground without taking any political sides, we are simply following the historical record here.
So whether you are trying to grasp the nuances of modern geopolitics, or, maybe you want to understand a pivotal piece of recent history.
Or you just want to know how a 2-decade global effort actually unfolded on the ground.
This deep dive is completely tailored for you. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start before the first shot is even fired by the United States.
Yeah, you really have to. To understand 2001, we need to know what Afghanistan actually looked like in the late 1990s.
Right. So set the scene for us.
Well, you have to picture a country utterly devastated by decades of prior conflict. First, you have the Soviet invasion in the 1980s.
Which was brutal.
Incredibly brutal. And that was followed immediately by a vicious civil war in the 1990s.
And out of that chaos, that's where the Taliban emerges, right?
Exactly. They originally formed from groups of religious students. I mean, the word Talib literally means student.
Huh, I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, and their initial appeal to the Afghan population was actually rooted in a desire for order.
Because the people were just exhausted, I imagine.
Utterly exhausted by the brutality of local warlords. So the Taliban promised to end warlordism and establish security.
Albeit through a violently strict adherence to their interpretation of Islamic law.
Right. It was a severe trade-off.
Are you?
But militarily speaking, it worked.
Because by the year 2001, they controlled roughly 90% of the country.
Yeah, they had founded the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The only real resistance left was this coalition known as the Northern Alliance.
And they were basically boxed into the northeast corner of the country.
Exactly. Geographically protected up in the Panjshir Valley. So the Taliban were the dominant, virtually uncontested power in Kabul.
But, and this is the massive but, their control of the country came with a critical alliance.
They were harboring al-Qaeda.
Right. Afghanistan provided a safe haven for Osama bin Laden and his network.
Al-Qaeda used that rugged remote terrain to train fighters, import weapons, and basically plot global terrorist actions.
And the numbers are wild. The historical estimates suggest anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men passed through these training facilities before September 11th.
It was a massive operation. Which, of course, brings us to the inciting incident for everything that follows.
September 11th, 2001. Al-Qaeda orchestrates the attacks in New York and Washington.
And the United States' immediate desire to hold bin Laden accountable becomes the absolute casus belli.
The undeniable cause for war.
Right. Following the attacks, U.S. President George W. Bush issues a clear ultimatum to the Taliban leadership.
Hand him over.
Basically, yes. Immediately extradite Osama bin Laden and permanently close down all al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan.
And the Taliban's response is one of those historical moments that kind of gets lost in the broader narrative today.
It really does. Because they don't just issue a flat, defiant no.
Right. They refuse the immediate extradition, sure, but they actually demand evidence of bin Laden's guilt.
And they offer a counterproposal.
Which is crazy to think about now. What was the proposal?
They offer to hand him over to a neutral third country to be tried under Islamic law.
Wow.
But that was provided the U.S. stops its bombing campaign and actually provides that evidence.
And the U.S. administration just dismisses these offers entirely.
Completely. An administration official famously stated that the demands were not subject to negotiation.
So the diplomatic door was slammed shut almost immediately.
Bang, closed.
But why the total dismissal? I mean, looking back with 20 years of hindsight, an offer to hand him over to a third country seems like a potential diplomatic off-ramp.
It does seem that way now.
So why didn't the U.S. even entertain the idea of calling their bluff?
Because of how the U.S. administration fundamentally viewed the enemy at that exact moment.
Okay, untack that.
Well, in the immediate, deeply traumatic aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. operated under the belief that the Taliban and al-Qaeda were functionally inseparable.
Like they were the exact same thing.
Exactly. They viewed them as a single, monolithic entity of global terrorism. But the historical record shows they actually had very different goals.
Right, and distinct leadership structures.
Yeah. Al-Qaeda had these sweeping global jihadist ambitions. They wanted to attack the West.
Whereas the Taliban?
The Taliban, conversely, were intensely insular. Their focus was entirely on national control of Afghanistan and implementing their specific local governance.
So, in the eyes of Washington, negotiating with the Taliban was the moral equivalent of negotiating with the architects of 9/11 themselves.
It was just politically impossible.
Which means the covert military action begins.
And it begins fast. While Operation Enduring Freedom officially kicks off with massive airstrikes on October 7, 2001.
The groundwork was already being laid on the ground, right?
Oh, yeah. Just 15 days after 9/11, the CIA covertly inserted members of their Special Activities Division into Afghanistan.
To link up with the Northern Alliance.
Exactly.
And this is where the mechanics of the early war are just wild to visualize.
It sounds like a movie.
It really does. You have these tiny 12-man U.S. Special Forces teams arriving in a completely hostile country.
Working with the CIA.
Right. And they are linking up with Northern Alliance fighters who have been fighting the Civil War for years.
And what did they do?
We are talking about highly trained U.S. operators literally riding on horseback through the freezing mountains of Afghanistan.
While using GPS receivers and lasers to paint Taliban targets for B-52 bombers flying miles above them.
It is an overwhelmingly successful synthesis of 19th century cavalry tactics and 21st century aerospace technology.
And with that devastating U.S. air support, the Northern Alliance was able to break out of their enclave.
They captured several key cities from the Taliban in a matter of weeks.
Because the Taliban simply could not comprehend or match the air power. Entire defensive lines evaporated.
They just retreated from major population centers, and by November of 2001, they had lost control of most of the country.
The speed of it is breathtaking.
It gave everyone whiplash. I mean, fewer than a dozen U.S. soldiers died in those initial months.
While thousands of Taliban fighters were killed or taken prisoner.
Which leads directly to the Bonn Conference in December 2001.
Right. The Taliban are ousted from Kabul, so the international community rushes to figure out who is going to run the country.
So the United Nations convenes this conference in Bonn, Germany.
Bringing together various Afghan anti-Taliban factions.
And they select Hamid Karzai to head the Afghan interim administration.
And Karzai was chosen largely because he was a prominent Pashtun leader.
Which is the majority ethnic group in Afghanistan.
Exactly. The same group the Taliban drew their strength from. So making him the leader was theoretically acceptable to the South.
But he also had the backing of the Northern Alliance in the West.
Yeah. And the UN also authorizes the creation of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF.
Which was initially just a small coalition force meant to help maintain security in Kabul itself.
Right.
Let me pause here, though, because this narrative of total victory in 2001 feels incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, they ousted the Taliban in a few weeks. But thinking that winning those initial battles meant winning the war is absurd.
It was a massive miscalculation.
It's like tearing down an old, dangerous building over a long weekend, dusting your hands off, but having absolutely no architectural blueprint for what to build in the empty lot.
That is a great analogy.
And worse, you're totally ignoring the fact the previous tenants didn't die. They just moved into the dark woods right next door.
That's a highly structural way to look at it.
Yeah.
And it's entirely accurate based on the sources.
Right.
The failure to capture Osama bin Laden at Tora Bora during this early stage was a massive tactical miss. But the grand strategic error was the Bonn Conference itself.
How so?
Well, by completely excluding the Taliban from any role in the new government formation, essentially treating them as a vanquished, irrelevant entity, The coalition guaranteed a future conflict.
Because they were defeated tactically in conventional battles, but they were not eliminated as a political or social force.
Exactly.
So they just melted away.
Well, melted away makes it sound like magic. It was geography and demographics.
Okay, what do you mean?
The surviving Taliban leadership, including their founder Mullah Omar, didn't vanish. They simply walked across the incredibly porous, largely unmapped Durand Line.
The border into neighboring Pakistan?
Yes. They retreated into the tribal areas, sat down, and waited.
Because they knew the terrain, they had deep tribal connections across the border, and they had time.
All the time in the world.
But because of that rapid, relatively low-casualty military success, there was this intoxicating false sense of finality in Washington and London.
They really thought the war was essentially over, just a mop-up operation remaining.
And that false sense of finality leads us directly into a massive geopolitical distraction.
Which brings us to the years 2002 to 2005. The gaze shifts.
Right. Following the initial success, the U.S. found itself occupying Afghanistan without a universally agreed-upon long-term goal.
Because the original singular objective was counterterrorism, hunting down al-Qaeda and punishing the Taliban for harboring them.
But nation-building, actually constructing a functioning democratic state that was actively opposed by the Bush administration initially?
They wanted what they called a light footprint.
Right. But as the coalition realized you can't just leave a vacuum, the rationale slowly morphed.
And then, in 2003, the United States makes a monumental pivot.
They invade Iraq.
The mechanical impact of the Iraq invasion on Afghanistan cannot be overstated.
It wasn't just a distraction of news headlines, right?
No, not at all. It was a massive physical diversion of resources. Special operations units, intelligence assets, surveillance drones, language experts.
And billions of dollars in funding.
Right. All abruptly redirected from Kabul to Baghdad.
It's the concept of a simmering pot left unattended on the back burner while you turn around to deal with a massive grease fire on the stove.
Yes.
You think the pot on the back burner is fine because it's not boiling over right this second, but you left the heat on.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And while the U.S. was looking toward Iraq, they were relying on a newly formed, deeply flawed Afghan army.
Because of that light footprint approach.
Yeah, the U.S. deferred heavily to the Northern Alliance and local warlords to maintain security in the provinces.
Rather than investing the necessary time and money to build a professional, independent, uncorrupt military force from the ground up.
Exactly. And the coalition forces that were left in Afghanistan made some devastating tactical choices during this window.
Right. The pressure to hunt down high-value terrorist targets led to incredibly aggressive operations.
Think about the mechanics of how intelligence was gathered then. Coalition troops would go on highly aggressive, terrifying night raids based on tips from local informants.
But those informants often weren't providing intelligence on terrorists.
No, they were weaponizing the American military to settle local scores.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a local power broker could tell the Americans that his business rival was a secret Taliban commander.
So the Americans would raid the rival's compound?
Perhaps kill him?
Yeah.
And the informant gets rid of his enemy while actually getting paid by the CIA?
That is deeply corrosive. I mean, you are actively turning the local population against you.
And the civilian toll of these operations was horrific. There are documented incidents of massive civilian casualties.
Like the devastating event with the wedding party?
Yes. A local wedding party where men traditionally fire guns into the air in celebration was misinterpreted by coalition aircraft as a hostile Taliban gathering.
And they bombed it.
They bombed it. You cannot drop a bomb on a wedding and then visit the surviving elders the next day and expect them to trust your democratic institution building.
Or your promises of security. It fundamentally destroys the psychological foundation of counterinsurgency.
It generated immense popular resentment.
And further complicating this, the promises made by the newly formed Afghan government were falling apart.
Yes, the historical record shows that many mid-level Taliban commanders had actually tried to give up their arms early on.
Right, they wanted to go back to their villages and live peacefully.
Especially after being promised amnesty by President Karzai.
But that amnesty wasn't respected on the ground.
Not at all. Those former fighters found themselves constantly harassed, detained, or extorted by local Afghan security forces.
Or they were targeted by U.S. Special Operations Forces who just weren't clued into the political amnesty deals.
Wait, so if the Taliban were largely defeated, scattered into Pakistan, some of their fighters were literally trying to surrender and go back to farming?
How on earth did they coordinate a massive countrywide insurgency just 3 years later?
Well, because the coalition essentially built the insurgency for them.
Wow.
By
Okay.
2004, those harassed former fighters realized surrender just wasn't a safe option.
Yeah.
So they fled across the border to Pakistan, rejoining the hardline leadership hiding there.
So the coalition's missteps, the civilian casualties, the night raids, empowering warlords, broken amnesty promises that all served as the ultimate recruitment tool.
The undeniable recruitment tool. The movement reorganized in the tribal areas of Pakistan.
And in late 2004, the hidden Taliban leader Mullah Omar officially announced a formal insurgency against American and Afghan government forces.
To, as he put it, regain the sovereignty of our country.
And they didn't just come back with the same old tactics, did they?
No, they adapted. They realized they couldn't fight the Americans in open battles. And there's a specific commander the data points to named Dadullah.
Oh, okay, tell me about him.
Mullah Dadullah was appointed as a senior military commander for the Taliban. And he introduced a terrifying new dynamic to the battlefield: suicide bombings.
Which is wild because historically, suicide attacks were not a Taliban tactic.
Exactly. It wasn't part of Afghan martial culture at all. It was an imported al-Qaeda tactic.
So how did Dadullah suddenly build an army of suicide bombers?
He utilized a vast network of radical madrasas, religious schools, located in Pakistan, that catered to impoverished Afghan refugees. These schools provided a captive audience of young, deeply indoctrinated, destitute men who were entirely disconnected from traditional Afghan village structures.
So Dadullah built a pipeline.
He took these radicalized students, convinced them of the glory of martyrdom against the foreign occupiers, and unleashed them into Afghan cities.
So by focusing intensely on aggressive, kinetic counterterrorism operations, the coalition accidentally alienated the rural population
Pushed the moderate fighters back into the arms of the extremists.
and fueled an insurgency that fundamentally changed the rules of engagement.
The pot on the back burner is now officially boiling over.
Which brings us to the massive escalation. The years 2006 to 2009. The battle for hearts and minds fails against the reality of open combat.
Right. By 2006, insurgent attacks had grown fourfold compared to 2002.
The Taliban began launching brutal, coordinated summer offensives.
Operations with names like Mountain Thrust and Medusa. You saw heavy conventional fighting in southern provinces like Helmand and Kandahar.
But the coalition forces were achieving tactical victories in these operations.
They were. They had superior firepower. They could roll into a valley, clear it of Taliban fighters, and declare the area secure.
But the mechanics of their strategy were flawed.
Because they had the troops to clear an area, but nowhere near the numbers required to hold it indefinitely.
So the moment the coalition forces moved on to the next valley,
The Taliban simply filtered right back in. It was a deadly, exhausting game of whack-a-mole.
and the friction between the foreign forces and the civilian population reaches a true boiling point during this time.
We really have to look at the 2006 Kabul riot here.
Because this event is a perfect, terrifying microcosm of what was going wrong mechanically with the occupation.
Walk us through it.
So, May 29, 2006, a U.S. military logistics truck is driving in a convoy through Kabul. It suffers a mechanical failure, loses control, and plows into a line of civilian vehicles.
It kills one person and injures 6.
A tragic but entirely mundane traffic accident.
Right. It wasn't a coordinated Taliban ambush. It was just a vehicle collision.
But look at what happens next. The surrounding crowd doesn't wait for ambulances. They become instantly, violently furious.
A riot erupts that engulfs the city and lasts all day.
The crowd starts throwing stones, setting fires, chanting anti-American slogans. U.S. troops actually have to fire their weapons to defend themselves as they flee the mob.
And by the end of the day, 20 people are dead and 160 are injured.
What does that tell you about the baseline psychology of the Afghan public at that moment? A traffic accident sparked a citywide deadly riot.
It reveals the massive, simmering groundswell of resentment. It proved that the Hearts and Minds campaign was a catastrophic failure in urban centers. The population didn't view the coalition as protectors.
They viewed them as an arrogant, reckless, occupying force.
Exactly. And militarily, the Taliban were growing incredibly bold. Let's talk about the 2008 Kandahar jailbreak.
Oh, man. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a Hollywood-level heist.
It was a highly sophisticated, coordinated assault. The Taliban used a massive tanker truck packed with explosives to blow open the main gates of the Sarposa prison in Kandahar.
And following the explosion, a wave of fighters armed with rockets and machine guns stormed the facility.
They systematically broke the locks on the cells and liberated roughly 1,200 prisoners.
And out of those 1,200, roughly 400 were confirmed Taliban fighters.
400 hardened insurgents instantly put back on the battlefield.
Wow.
It was a staggering operational embarrassment for NATO and the Afghan security forces. It showed that the government couldn't even secure its most important infrastructure.
But strategically, the Taliban makes an incredibly vital pivot around this time, too.
Right. Looking at the intelligence assessments from late 2008, the Taliban appears to sever their remaining operational ties with al-Qaeda.
The U.S. military estimates suggested there were perhaps fewer than 100 members of al-Qaeda left in Afghanistan at that point.
And if we look closely at the political mechanics, this was a highly calculated rebranding effort by the Taliban leadership.
They realized that their association with al-Qaeda and global jihad was drawing the full wrath of the American military.
They didn't want to be seen by the international community as terrorists plotting attacks in London or New York.
They wanted to legitimize themselves.
So they pivoted their propaganda to frame themselves strictly as a nationalist resistance movement, fighting a righteous war to expel a foreign occupation and reclaim their own homeland.
Rebranding the insurgency for a domestic audience.
Yes.
And it was working so well that the U.S. felt it had to drastically change its entire approach.
In 2009, the new Obama administration comes into office, reviews the deteriorating situation, and approves a massive surge of troops.
They sent tens of thousands of additional American soldiers to Afghanistan, alongside a massive increase in controversial drone strikes in Pakistan.
Because they're attempting to finally implement a true counterinsurgency strategy.
Right.
COIN.
Right.
The goal is to flood the South with troops to finally hold the ground after clearing it, providing enough security for the Afghan government to build local infrastructure and win back the population.
But the political reality in Kabul is completely contradicting the military reality on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. Hamid Karzai is reelected in 2009 in an election that is heavily marred by international claims of massive fraud.
And interestingly, in a televised speech shortly after his contested victory, Karzai publicly calls on our Taliban brothers to come home and embrace their land.
It's a striking contradiction.
Yeah.
You have the U.S. surging tens of thousands of young soldiers into brutal combat in Helmand province,
while the president of the very country they are defending is publicly referring to the enemy as brothers and signaling a desire for a political settlement.
The disconnect is just jarring.
And it ushers us into the peak years of the war, 2010 to 2013. We hit the absolute maximum military footprint, followed immediately by a drastic pivot.
And a catastrophic cascade of fractured trust.
So the troop surge hits its zenith in 2011. There are roughly 140,000 foreign troops,
primarily American and British, operating under the ISAF command across Afghanistan. It is a staggering logistical enterprise.
And right in the middle of this massive, grinding military undertaking, an event happens outside of Afghanistan that completely rips the psychological foundation out from under the entire war.
May 2, 2011, Operation Neptune Spear.
U.S. Navy SEALs conduct a covert nighttime raid in Ahmedabad, Pakistan. They locate and kill Osama bin Laden.
The man who orchestrated 9/11 is dead.
And suddenly, the average American citizen, who has been vaguely paying attention to a decade-long war, looks at the news and asks a very logical question.
Wait, didn't we invade Afghanistan specifically to get the guy who did 9/11?
Right. If he's dead and he wasn't even in Afghanistan, why do we currently have 140,000 troops fighting and dying in random farming villages in Helmand province?
It's the moment the narrative collapses. As we discussed, the original casus belli was counterterrorism.
But over 10 years, the mission had morphed into an impossibly broad nation-building and counterinsurgency effort.
With bin Laden dead, the Obama administration loses the core psychological justification for keeping such a massive force engaged.
So almost immediately, Washington announces a withdrawal plan, starting with pulling out 10,000 troops by the end of the year.
And as the U.S. clearly starts looking for the exit doors, the relationship between the coalition forces and the Afghan people goes through its absolute darkest, most toxic period.
The year 2012 is just a relentless, grueling string of public relations disasters and horrific criminal incidents.
The historical record catalogs a series of events that completely obliterated any remaining moral authority the coalition claimed to hold.
Like what?
Well, in January, a video surfaced showing U.S. Marines laughing and urinating on the bloodied corpses of dead Taliban fighters.
Oh my God.
Then in February, massive, deadly protests erupt across the country. It was revealed that U.S. military personnel at Bagram Air Base had improperly disposed of Islamic religious materials,
including burning copies of the Quran in a burn pit.
Exactly. Then in March, the horrific Panjwai massacre occurs. A U.S. Army staff sergeant leaves his base in the middle of the night, walks to two nearby villages.
And systematically murders 16 Afghan civilians in their homes, including 9 children.
Before setting some of their bodies on fire.
And the hits just keep coming. Another video emerges showing a U.S. helicopter crew singing the pop song American Pie while firing a Hellfire missile into a group of Afghan men on the ground.
It's just devastating.
So put yourself in the shoes of an Afghan army commander. How on earth are you supposed to motivate your troops to fight alongside the Americans?
You can't.
Right. How is a coalition military supposed to successfully train and advise an allied Afghan force when these high-profile, incredibly disrespectful, and murderous incidents are constantly destroying any shred of mutual respect?
It created an insurmountable fracture. This is the era where we see a massive spike in what the military called green-on-blue attacks.
Explain the mechanics of that. What is a green-on-blue attack?
Green refers to the Allied Afghan security forces, and blue refers to NATO or U.S. forces. These were insider attacks.
Meaning?
Afghan soldiers or police officers or Taliban infiltrators wearing their uniforms would turn their weapons on the American or British troops who were embedded with them to train them.
Wow.
It bred an atmosphere of profound paranoia. U.S. soldiers were ordered to carry loaded weapons at all times, even inside their own secure bases.
Essentially expecting the people they were training to shoot them in the back.
Exactly. It's a complete degradation of the partnership.
And it fuels the exact narrative the Taliban were pushing, that the foreign forces were immoral occupiers that brought nothing but degradation.
Yet despite this toxic environment, the political timeline moves forward, regardless of the reality on the ground.
By June 2013, the transfer of security responsibilities from NATO to the Afghan forces is officially completed on paper.
The dynamic of the war fundamentally shifts. ISAF prepares to end its combat mission, setting the stage for the transition to an Afghan-led war from 2014 to 2017.
So in 2014, combat operations officially end for the U.S. and its allies.
The mission changes its name to Resolute Support.
The goal is no longer leading the fight. It's training, advising, and assisting the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces from the rear.
But here's where we need to look at the logistical reality.
Okay.
As the official foreign military presence shrinks drastically, dropping down to just over 10,000 troops, a massive shadow army steps in to replace them.
Military contractors. Let's dive into how this actually worked, because people hear contractors and they think of mercenaries with assault rifles.
Right.
But it's much more structural than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. The U.S. government hired tens of thousands of private contractors to fill the gaping logistical voids left by withdrawing troops.
While some provided perimeter security, the vast majority were essential technicians, right?
They were the mechanics maintaining the Afghan Air Force's Black Hawk helicopters. They were the IT specialists running the secure communication networks.
They were managing the complex supply chains required to move ammunition and fuel across a mountainous country.
The Afghan military was built by the U.S. to fight like the U.S. military.
Which means it required an incredibly sophisticated, expensive logistical tail.
Exactly.
So the Afghan army is like a high-end sports car. It looks great, it has massive firepower, but it requires incredibly specialized mechanics to keep it running.
And those mechanics are almost entirely foreign contractors.
Wow. And with the Afghan army now officially taking the brunt of the frontline combat, the cracks in that system immediately show.
In 2015, the northern city of Kunduz falls to the Taliban.
The Taliban taking a major provincial capital is a massive shock to the system.
It was brief. The Afghan forces, heavily relying on U.S. airstrikes and special operations advisors, recaptured the city a couple of weeks later.
But the psychological damage was permanent.
The fall of Kunduz proved to the Afghan public and to the Taliban themselves that the insurgents were capable of capturing and holding major urban centers against the Afghan National Army.
And just when you think the battlefield couldn't get more chaotic, the conflict fractures again.
A brand new, hyper-violent faction enters the fray.
In 2015, the Islamic State Khorasan province, known as ISIS-K, officially emerges in eastern Afghanistan.
This development completely scrambles the tactical map. ISIS-K represents a fundamental ideological split.
Because they view the Taliban as essentially sellouts, right?
Yeah, too focused on Afghan nationalism, too willing to engage in diplomacy, and not radically pure enough in their vision of a global caliphate.
So now it's not a two-sided war. You have the Afghan government fighting the Taliban. You have the Afghan government fighting ISIS-K.
And you have the Taliban fighting ISIS-K in brutal turf wars.
It's a devastating three-way meat grinder.
Furthermore, within the Taliban umbrella itself, Power dynamics are shifting.
The Connie network.
Yes, a semi-autonomous, highly organized, and notoriously brutal faction based near the Pakistani border, they gain immense operational control.
They steer the Taliban toward deadlier, high-profile complex attacks in urban centers like Kabul.
Focusing heavily on mass casualty bombings.
By 2017, the political winds in Washington shift again. The Trump administration comes in, reviews the stalemate, and decides to try and bomb their way out of the deadlock.
They deploy a few thousand more troops. But more importantly, they fundamentally alter the rules of engagement.
Explain that. What changed?
Previously, to minimize civilian casualties, U.S. air power was heavily restricted. Airstrikes usually required troops on the ground to be in direct contact, actively taking fire from the enemy.
But the Trump administration relaxed those rules.
They allowed commanders to proactively target insurgent networks. And a massive part of this new strategy was heavily targeting Taliban drug production facilities.
Let's talk about the drug trade because it's the financial engine of the war.
It really is.
Despite billions of dollars spent over a decade and a half on poppy eradication programs, paying farmers to grow wheat instead, or literally driving tractors over poppy fields, Afghanistan remained the world's absolute, undisputed largest producer of illicit opiates.
The opiate trade was deeply ingrained in the rural economy. And for the Taliban, it was a golden goose.
Because they taxed the farmers, they protected the smuggling routes, and they ran the processing labs.
The intelligence estimates suggested the drug trade was generating tens of millions of dollars annually for the insurgency.
Easily funding their weapons, salaries, and explosives.
So the U.S. starts dropping incredibly expensive precision bombs on makeshift drug labs in Helmand province.
But dropping a $100,000 bomb on a mud hut full of opium isn't going to end a guerrilla war.
No, it's not.
By 2018, the stark reality sets in across all capitals. A strict military victory is mathematically out of reach for everyone.
The Afghan government, even with U.S. air support, cannot completely eradicate the Taliban from the rural areas.
The Taliban, as long as U.S. bombers are flying overhead, cannot completely topple the government in Kabul.
And the American public is completely exhausted.
Which leads us into the critical, final diplomatic phase. The years 2018 to 2020, the peace overtures, and the Doha Agreement.
And this period begins not with diplomats in suits, but with a truly remarkable, heartbreaking moment of grassroots civilian desperation.
In early 2018, an unprecedented peace movement erupts organically in Afghanistan. The media dubbed it the Helmand Peace Convoy.
It started in Helmand province, which had arguably seen the most intense, prolonged combat of the entire war.
And a group of regular Afghan citizens, teachers, farmers, civil society activists decided they had simply had enough of the daily slaughter.
They began walking.
They walked several hundred kilometers, right through active war zones, right through Taliban-held territory, all the way to the capital city of Kabul.
They held sit-in protests, enduring blistering heat and fasting for Ramadan on the road,
demanding an immediate end to the violence from both sides.
And their immense courage actually helped pressure leadership on both sides to agree to an unprecedented temporary ceasefire during the Eid al-Fitr celebrations in June 2018.
And the scenes that unfolded during those 3 days were completely surreal.
You had Taliban fighters, guys who had spent years hiding in mountains, flooding into the cities.
They were taking selfies with locals, eating ice cream, and literally hugging state security forces in the streets.
It was a profound psychological release, but it also terrified the leadership of both the Taliban and the Afghan government.
Because it highlighted just how desperate the average Afghan citizen was for peace. The rank-and-file fighters were tired of fighting.
The ceasefire inevitably expires and the violence resumes, but the diplomatic gears are finally turning.
Direct, high-level talks begin between the United States and the Taliban in Doha, Qatar.
And a key figure sitting across the table representing the insurgents is Abdulghani Burdar.
Burdar is a fascinating figure. He was a co-founder of the Taliban alongside Mullah Omar.
He had actually been arrested by Pakistani intelligence in 2010. But the U.S. requested his release in 2018, specifically because they believed he carried enough authority within the Taliban ranks to negotiate a binding peace deal.
So the U.S. and the Taliban sit down in Doha. And on February 29, 2020, they sign a historic conditional peace agreement.
The mechanics of the deal are relatively straightforward on paper.
The United States agrees to a full, phased withdrawal of all its military forces and all NATO coalition forces within 14 months.
And in exchange for the Americans leaving, The Taliban pledges a single core security guarantee.
Which is?
They promise not to let Afghan soil be used by any militant group, including al-Qaeda, to stage terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies.
Essentially, the U.S. says we are leaving, and the Taliban says we won't let another 9/11 happen.
Right. But there is a glaring, massive, fatal omission in this treaty.
A missing chair at the table.
The internationally recognized Afghan government, led by President Ashraf Ghani in Kabul, is not a party to the deal.
The United States negotiated the terms of Afghanistan's future directly with the insurgents, completely excluding the sovereign government they had spent 20 years bleeding to protect.
Think about the crushing tragedy of that dynamic.
The Helmand peace convoy marches hundreds of miles, citizens risking their lives, begging for their voices to be heard in the peace process.
But the ultimate fate of their country is decided in a luxury hotel room in Qatar.
Between American diplomats and Taliban commanders bypassing the Afghan voters entirely.
Let's analyze the mechanical effect of that decision. By negotiating directly with the Taliban and deliberately sidelining the government in Kabul, the United States inherently delegitimized President Ghani.
The U.S. signaled to the entire country, and crucially to the Afghan military, that the real power rested with the Taliban.
The psychological damage to the Afghan state was terminal.
President Ghani is absolutely furious, and understandably so.
He's particularly enraged because the U.S.-Taliban deal includes a mandate for the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners currently held in Afghan government jails.
Ghani rightly points out that the U.S. diplomats do not have the legal or moral authority to promise the release of prisoners held in another sovereign nation's prisons.
But Ghani's government is entirely dependent on U.S. financial aid and military support to survive.
So, under immense pressure from Washington, who is desperate to keep the peace deal intact, Ghani is ultimately forced to capitulate.
The Afghan government releases the 5,000 prisoners.
Thousands of battle-hardened Taliban commanders and fighters are injected directly back into the insurgent ranks.
Right at the exact moment the U.S. military is actively packing up its bases to leave.
Which brings us to the catastrophic climax of our timeline. The year 2021, the final offensive, and the last flight out.
The new Biden administration assumes office in Washington.
After a brief review, President Biden announces that he will honor the withdrawal agreement initiated by his predecessor, extending the final deadline slightly to the end of August 2021.
And the Taliban, seeing the clock ticking down and the U.S. troops actively leaving, launch a sweeping, massive summer offensive.
The speed of this final offensive stunned the entire global intelligence community.
In the first 3 months of the summer, the Taliban captured vast swaths of the rural countryside.
They isolated the provincial capitals, cutting off supply lines. And then the cities began falling like dominoes.
It wasn't a slow, grinding, fighting retreat by the Afghan National Army. It was a dam breaking.
Entire corps were surrendering without firing a single shot. I mean, how does a military of over 300,000 nominally trained soldiers melt away in a matter of weeks?
We have to return to the sports car analogy from earlier.
Right, the structural reliance.
The collapse was a structural inevitability. It wasn't simply a lack of moral will to fight among the average Afghan soldier.
As we discussed, the Afghan military apparatus was structurally designed to rely on advanced U.S. logistics.
It required close air support to break Taliban sieges. It required U.S. intelligence gathering to know where the enemy was.
And crucially, it required thousands of civilian contractors to maintain their aircraft and weapons systems.
When the U.S. announced the final withdrawal, they didn't just pull out the combat troops. They pulled out the contractors overnight.
They turned off the intelligence feeds, they grounded the air support.
They removed the scaffolding. Once that framework was abruptly yanked away, the Afghan military apparatus physically could not sustain itself.
Soldiers out in remote outposts ran out of food and ammunition.
When they radioed for an airdrop of supplies or a medevac for their wounded, no helicopters came because there were no contractors left to repair the helicopters.
Realizing they were completely abandoned by Kabul and Washington, local commanders made the rational survival choice.
They cut deals with the advancing Taliban to surrender in exchange for their lives.
And the collapse accelerates exponentially. On August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters walk unopposed into the capital city of Kabul.
President Ashraf Ghani, realizing the security forces have evaporated, boards a helicopter and flees the country.
The Taliban seize the empty presidential palace and declare total victory,
The sudden fall of Kabul triggered an immediate massive panic among the population.
leading directly to the frantic airlift at Hamid Karzai International Airport.
For 2 grueling weeks, The airport becomes the only heavily fortified piece of American-held territory left in the country.
And the scenes are apocalyptic. Tens of thousands of desperate people, foreign diplomats, aid workers, and incredibly vulnerable Afghans who had spent years working alongside the coalition as translators or fixers swarmed the tarmac.
Amidst total chaos, terror attacks by ISIS-K, and profound desperation, the U.S. and its allies managed to airlift over 122,000 people out of the country.
It was one of the largest non-combatant evacuation operations in military history.
But it was a chaotic, bloody exit.
The footage of young Afghan men clinging to the landing gear of moving C-17 transport planes falling from the sky as the plane ascends will forever be the defining, tragic image of the end of this war.
And finally, on the stroke of midnight on August 30, the final U.S. Air Force plane lifts off from the runway.
After 19 years, 10 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, the longest war in American history is officially over.
Which leaves us with the aftermath. We have to look at the sobering, devastating reality of what the coalition left behind once the dust settled on that empty runway.
The sheer human cost of the conflict is staggering.
The historical data estimates that between 176,000 and well over 212,000 people were killed directly in the violence.
That includes over 46,000 Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire.
And over 66,000 Afghan national security forces who died fighting the insurgency.
And the immediate humanitarian crisis that followed the Taliban's takeover was severe and systemic.
Over 2.6 million Afghans remained as refugees abroad, with another 4 million internally displaced within the country's borders.
International aid, which had propped up the Afghan economy for 2 decades, was instantly suspended.
Billions of dollars in Afghan central bank assets were frozen in Western banks to keep them out of Taliban hands.
This financial shock accelerated a widespread economic collapse, plunging millions into extreme poverty and triggering acute warnings of famine.
And as we touched on earlier, despite all the billions spent and all the bombs dropped on drug labs, the country remained an entrenched narco-state,
cementing its status as the world's largest opiate producer.
But perhaps the most damning revelation about the fundamental nature of the war came slightly before the chaotic end, in 2019, with the release of what became known as the Afghanistan Papers.
The Afghanistan Papers were a trove of over 2,000 pages of confidential government documents obtained and published by the Washington Post.
These documents were generated by a federal watchdog agency, and they contained candid, unpublished interviews with over 400 key military and political figures who were directly involved in managing the war.
And what did these internal documents reveal?
They showed a shocking, systemic pattern of deceit.
They revealed that U.S. officials across multiple administrations consistently and deliberately misled the public about the reality on the ground.
Behind closed doors, generals and diplomats admitted they had no idea what they were doing, that the strategy was fundamentally flawed, and that the conflict was unwinnable.
But publicly, they kept spinning the data to present a false narrative of continuous progress.
The documents connect the dots of failure across 2 decades.
They highlight the early tactical arrogance in 2001, the catastrophic diversion of resources to Iraq,
The reliance on corrupt warlords, and the inability to understand Afghan culture.
They prove that the systemic failures that caused the rapid collapse in 2021 were recognized internally by leadership long before they were ever admitted to the public.
And the most painful lingering wound of this aftermath is the profound sense of betrayal felt by the Afghan allies who were left behind when the music stopped.
The historical record specifically highlights the agonizing plight of former Afghan special forces.
These were the absolute elite troops, heavily vetted, who fought shoulder to shoulder with NATO operators for years.
Their treatment post-withdrawal has been heavily scrutinized.
For instance, reports emerged that hundreds of these elite Afghan commandos who fought directly alongside British troops were rejected for resettlement in the UK.
One former UK Special Forces officer even publicly alleged that bureaucratic decisions in British headquarters actively prevented these former Afghan colleagues, some of whom were potential witnesses to alleged war crimes, from securing safe passage.
It highlights a dark, unresolved legacy of abandonment.
So we arrive at the end of our chronological timeline.
From the ashes of 9/11 and the lightning-fast 2001 invasion through the fatal distraction of Iraq.
The Taliban's relentless resurgence from the madrasas of Pakistan, the massive surges that failed to hold ground.
The devastating cultural friction that destroyed trust, the exclusionary backroom peace talks in Doha, all the way to that frantic, apocalyptic final airlift in August 2021.
And analyzing this 20-year span is absolutely vital.
It serves as a stark historical masterclass in the absolute limits of military intervention.
It clearly demonstrates the mechanical reality that overwhelming tactical firepower can win battles, but those military victories will be completely, totally undone if you fail to secure an inclusive, culturally viable political settlement.
You simply cannot build a functioning nation-state entirely through the narrow lens of counterterrorism.
We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of a clean narrative arc in history. We wanted a story with a clear moral.
But the architecture of this 20-year war wasn't a building being constructed. It was a sprawling, multi-trillion-dollar structure built on shifting sands.
With a blueprint that changed every time a new general or politician took charge, while the original tenants simply waited patiently in the dark woods next door.
And now, 20 years later, the original tenants hold the keys once again.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering thought to explore. What happens to a generation of Afghans? The millions of men, and especially the women who spent the last 20 years growing up under the promise, however flawed and corrupt, of a republic.
A generation who were told by the international community that they could vote, that they could attend university, that they could speak freely.
What happens to the psychology of a nation when that generation wakes up one morning, looks out their window, and finds themselves living back in a fundamentalist emirate?
How does a society reconcile the ghosts of a two-decade war when the architects of that war have simply packed up their planes and flown away?
That's all for today's deep dive.